Welcome back to Turning Hard Times into Good Times. I'm really pleased to have with me once again Richard Maybury, who I hope will be joining me on a fairly regular basis. I like to talk to Richard after I've read his latest monthly letter, and after reading the March letter, well, they're all good. It's one of those letters that, you get newsletters sometimes, you say, okay, all right, it's here. Okay, when I get to it, I'll read it. But with Richard Maybury, it's one of those letters I have to open immediately and read it, because he always has insights that are unique and objective. And, well, he calls himself, I don't know, it's a 2,000-year-old man or something like that, 4,000-year-old, 5,000-year-old man. And he's a real strong history buff. He also understands Austrian economics. He's written books, several of them. I think you can buy, they can buy all of them. They're on his website at richardmaybury.com. That's Maybury.com, richardmaybury.com. Books like Uncle Eric talks about personal, career, and financial security. Whatever happened to penny candy? Whatever happened to justice? Those are some of the books that are there available, and really, I think, gives you insights into why things are happening the way they're happening from a point of view that you're certainly not going to get in the mainstream. And, of course, that's why we like to have Richard with us. Thanks for joining me again, Richard.
Oh, I love being here. Thanks a lot, Jay.
Really always fun to talk to you, and I know it's because I really enjoy your work and your insights. And we're, of course, of kindred spirits, as both of us are Austrian believers in liberty and the right of the individual, the sanctity of the individual, if you will, as opposed to the state. The state is always there to try to take away our liberty. The idea that our rights come from Obama or from Hitler or from Stalin or somebody like that, as opposed to having natural rights. As a Christian, I believe they come from God. You don't have to believe that. You can believe that you have the right as an individual, as an entity, to be who you are, uniquely who you are, that we're each, and it seems to me, Richard, that most of these statist countries, and that would be us, of course, now, they want to take away our individuality. They don't want me to be Jay Taylor. They don't want you to be Richard Maybury. They want us all to sort of goose step in order alongside each other, think alike, and believe alike, and do everything alike, right?
Oh, yes. You do a very good job of explaining that sort of thing. That's why I enjoy listening to you. The Austrian economist Ludwig von Mises used to complain a lot about what he called the presumption of knowledge that students are taught in college, and that I am sure practically every leader in Washington was taught in college, especially Obama. The kids come out of college thinking that there are experts who understand how the economy works.
Yeah.
And
well, it's just like in the Kremlin, right?
Yeah, right. The same socialist assumption that there are people who understand the economy, and that because they understand it, they're entitled to force their plans onto the rest of us in order to make the world a better place. Right. And that's insane. There's nobody that understands the economy. It's not a machine. You'll notice in the mainstream news media, you can tell all the people who were trained in these kinds of colleges, they talk about the economy like it's a machine. It can be adjusted, or it can be tuned, or it can be speeded up or slowed down. The economy is not a machine. It's people, human beings. It's an ecology, and it's the most complex ecology on the planet. If you look at a tropical rainforest or a tropical reef, you're looking at some of the most complex ecologies in the natural world. But the human ecology, which we call the economy, is just unimaginably more complex than that. And these people come out of college thinking there's somebody who understands it.
Yeah.
It's crazy.
Richard, what bothers me more than anything else is the fact that they do not think they need to inspect the results. They do not need to evaluate the results of their policies. They just continue doing the same thing over and over again, even more so. And the idea is that if it didn't work in the 1930s, it wasn't perfected. And this time, by golly, we're going to make sure we got it right. So onward they march. But I would like to I would like to really sort of focus on your last newsletter, and again suggest to my listeners that you consider subscribing to Richard Maybury's early warning report. And again, it's Richard Maybury, MayBury.com. Go there to sign up for this letter. It's not expensive, and it's just filled with all kinds of insights that you're not going to get anywhere else. And but the one I'd like to focus on as much as we can this week is your last letter that talked about the importance of the Swiss National Bank's decision to detach the Swiss franc from the euro. First of all, could you sort of give us an idea, why did the Swiss decide to attach the Swiss franc to the euro to start with, going back, I guess, a couple of years ago now, wasn't it?
Yeah. In 2011, they did that. An awful lot of economics, as well as geopolitics and war and all the other things, can be understood by looking at maps. And if you look at a map of Europe, you find Switzerland in the exact center of Europe, which means that the Swiss are landlocked, so they can't very easily put things on ships and trade with other countries. They have to trade with the people immediately around them. And so their whole economy, which is a very, very advanced economy, one of the most advanced in the world, is heavily intertwined with the countries around them. And that means that when they're trying to do business with the people in the countries around them, they need to have some sort of a currency arrangement where the values of the currencies aren't bouncing around all over the place. Because when you're making a business deal, you've got to be able to plan ahead, and you need to have some sense of what prices are going to be tomorrow before you can set up your agreements to do whatever you're going to do. And so the Swiss have tried to keep the Swiss franc tied to the euro so that there was very little currency fluctuation between the two. If you've traveled in Europe, let's say, back in the days when each country had their own currency, the currencies were always bouncing all over, and it was really hard to know from one day to the next what something was really going to cost in your own terms. And so the Swiss, in 2011, they tied the Swiss franc to the euro so that as the euro went up or down, the Swiss franc would go right with it, and that made it easier to do business with the people all around them. But the Europeans subscribed to European Central Bank and the other European countries. They subscribed to the Keynesian economic viewpoint, which says governments should control practically everything and manipulate whatever it takes to do whatever they want to get done. And so the European Central Bank had been printing euros, counterfeiting euros, and the value of each individual euro was falling. Mm-hmm. And the Swiss were being forced to force their own currency down with the euro. Mm-hmm. And their own money was losing value because of this peg to the euro. And they were complaining, and the Swiss have been complaining for a half century or so about the other governments' mismanagements of their currencies and how much chaos that caused. But nobody listened to the Swiss, just like nobody ever did. And finally the Swiss just washed their hands of it and says, we aren't going to devalue our currency any further, and they cut it loose from the euro, and the Swiss franc bounced way up. And what the point I make in early warning report in that March issue is that the mainstream news media missed this entirely. It's like it was big news for 1 or 2 days, and then it was gone.
Right.
But what the Swiss were doing was the same thing they did back in 1973 when the same situation came up with the dollar declining in value, and the Swiss finally said, we're not going to have any part of it, and they cut loose at that time from the dollar, and in fact from all other currencies, and they let the Swiss franc float up. That was the precursor to the really big inflation that occurred in the late 70s and early 80s.
Ah, yeah.
And the point I made in the newsletter is we can't be certain that this is history repeating, but it seems very likely that the Swiss once again are announcing that the world had better look out because these stupid governments have been doing the same thing they were doing in the 70s, which is printing their currencies like crazy, and there's a really big inflation coming. And the wise man will be getting out of these paper currencies. Now, the Swiss do not make any friends by by making that announcement. No. It's just they're forced into a position where they've got the best currency in the world, and they want to keep having the best currency in the world, and they can't do it if the franc is tied to these other currencies. So they bailed out. And to me, it's not a certainty that this is going to signal a coming severe inflation, but it's a really high probability, and the wise investor will pay attention to it.
Mm-hmm. I'm just trying to understand the politics of why the Swiss would, why they would do what they did when they did it. But of course, initially when they linked to the euro, the Swiss was stronger. It was getting stronger all the time, and it was hurting their exports, supposedly. I'm sure it was to an extent. Mm-hmm. But then on the other hand, Richard, the Swiss, because of their strong currency and their traditions for banking is probably their most important industry, I'm guessing. I believe that's the case. Yep. And so I would imagine that if people around the world started to see the Swiss franc start to get watered down like everything else, that might have hurt their banking interest. Do you think that might have been part of what played into their detachment from the Swiss, from the euro again? Yeah,
that's very true. The Swiss are famous for having the most prudent bankers in the world and for being a refuge for people who are living in tyranny and need to get their money out of their countries and put it in a safe place, because Switzerland has a better reputation for bank privacy than anybody else does. So an awful lot of the Swiss main product to the world, which is banking, is this image of prudence. And as the Swiss franc stays tied to other currencies and is dragged down by them, the Swiss run the risk of losing that reputation for prudence. And so in order to keep their banking system alive and healthy and credible, they were in the position where they had to say, what they did say, which was, these other governments are irresponsible fools, and we're all headed for disaster, and we Swiss are bailing out now. Yeah.
Yeah, so you look at it a little bit like the canary in the coal mine, perhaps.
Right, that's a good analogy, yes.
The Swiss are sending a message to the rest of the world, look, this is crazy. We can't deal with this anymore. And yet the Swiss, they had a chance to back that gold referendum last year that would have really underpinned, or would have really solidified and made a statement, I would have thought. But maybe they were uncomfortable with that as well. They probably wanted to have it both ways a little bit. They wanted to have the flexibility of increasing the money supply if they wanted to and not. Do you think that's maybe you made the case in your newsletter that they're probably the closest thing to Austrian economic thinkers among central bankers in the world, and yet they're not really, are they? Right.
One of the many disadvantages of being in a geographic location where they are is that they're entirely surrounded by a culture of socialists, and there is this socialist propaganda that's constantly being pumped into Switzerland. And so the Swiss population is not of one mind about economics or anything else. And
sure.
As time goes on, the Swiss model of life slowly is being eroded by this socialist pressure, And there's millions of people in Switzerland. Well, maybe not millions. I don't know. I shouldn't say that, but some large number of people in Switzerland who are influential and in one way or another, and are being dragged over to this diabolical economic philosophy that's wrecking the rest of the world. The Swiss are better off than anybody else because they're dragging their feet in this journey toward socialism. But they disagree with each other, and the ones who are the most corrupted are dragging along the rest to some extent.
Yeah, well, certainly the international bodies are very much involved in Switzerland, and think of Davos and some of those things. I mean, definitely they have their influence, and as a tiny little country in the middle of a socialist world, it's hard to, I suppose, to remain pure, but certainly they've tried. The Swiss also, you've pointed out in another letter earlier on, maybe several months ago, about the Swiss military, really very unique situation too. You talked about the Swiss system and the Roman system. Maybe just take a minute to discuss that and how that sort of ties in with the monetary system.
Yeah, this is one of my favorite subjects. I wish Americans would get familiar with Switzerland. It teaches so many great lessons. In fact, when the American founders were putting together the Constitution and Bill of Rights, they studied Switzerland, and you'll see in the Federalist Papers where they quote or they cite various parts of Swiss culture as something that Americans should copy. And one of the things is the Second Amendment, the right to keep and bear arms. The Swiss are in the exact center of the bloodiest place in the world. In the last 200 years or so, there have been more than 140 wars in Switzerland, in Europe. 140 wars that these other Europeans have fought, and the Swiss have not participated in any of them. Even World War I and World War II, as awful as those were, and Switzerland was entirely surrounded by both of them, the Swiss do not participate. And nobody attacks them because they have a military force that is astounding. There's an old saying that Switzerland does not have an army. Switzerland is an army.
Everybody's trained to defend their own castle. Is that it?
That's exactly right. Marksmanship is pretty much the national sport, and the typical Swiss militiaman keeps his battle rifle and ammunition in his home, and he's ready to turn out to defend the country at any moment. And the William Tell legend that we kind of consider to be a sort of a fairy tale is taken as a serious lesson by the Swiss. And what Americans don't quite get is that what William Tell did after the Apple incident is he went out looking for the ruler who was behind the invasion of his country, and he killed the ruler. And that is part of the Swiss model, is if somebody invades our country, okay, we'll go after the privates and corporals if we have to, but what we're really going to do is go after the generals and the colonels and the politicians. And the Swiss are very much into free trade. They trade with everybody all over the world. We've all, for instance, seen the Swiss Army knife, the little pocket knife. There's lots of Swiss business done all over the world, which means there are Swiss all over the world all the time, and each of them is a sniper.
You don't want to tangle with the Swiss if you're. But here, Richard, if everybody has a gun in their home, they must have a horrendously high murder rate in Switzerland.
Actually, it's one of the safest countries in the world.
I'm playing devil's advocate here because that's what we hear in New York City. That's what we hear in New York City. I mean, we can't allow people to be armed because, oh my goodness, they would be. Of course, that's a false flag. Yeah,
an interesting point to focus on that most Americans never pay attention to, and the Second Amendment. Big battles going on all the time with the Second Amendment. The Second Amendment says a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state. It starts off with the words well-regulated. And that's what the Swiss have. The whole country is trained in the proper use of firearms. It's not just a bunch of yahoos that go down to the local gun shop and get a gun and go out and use it without being trained. These people are very well trained, and they keep their battle rifles in their homes. So, I mean, it's like there's almost no crime rate at all because every Swiss crook knows that when he breaks into somebody's house, he's going in against a trained soldier with a battle rifle. So his job is very short.
Well, yeah, everybody would be a threat if you tried to invade Switzerland. I guess every house would have its own firepower.
Yeah.
Getting back with just a couple of minutes left here, my engineer is telling me 3 minutes. We're looking at the Swiss. How do you see this thing playing out then, Richard? If we're going to be the Swiss, we're seeing negative interest rates essentially in Switzerland because people around the world are sending their money there, and because it's like you have to pay the bank to keep your money now. I mean, this is insanity. It seems to me. Of course, they are wrecking capitalism. They're destroying the policymakers are destroying capitalism around the world by not allowing the price mechanism, price discovery of capital, essentially by destroying the. So how is this going to play out then? Do you see Europe? Of course, the euro is shrinking very rapidly now as Draghi and these guys are, I guess really people are believing they're really going to start quantitative easing there. So. So the Swiss franc is going to continue to get stronger, but in order to put your money in a Swiss bank, well, first of all, Americans aren't allowed to anymore. The Swiss don't want us over there because of Uncle Sam sticking his nose in the Swiss banks, right? And turning all of us in as crooks for doing it. So what's going to happen?
Well,
how's it going to play out?
I think, there's some things that I'm very confident about. One of them is that the whole world, all these paper currencies, are going to come under tremendous pressure, and they're going to lose most of their values. That includes the dollar. Practically every other one will. The Swiss franc might survive it because they've got a lot of gold to back the Swiss franc, and at some point they may start back in that direction again. It's the best bet, and that's why people are paying to put their money in Switzerland right now.
Yeah, right.
They think it's the currency that has the best chance of surviving. The other ones, and especially the dollar, I think don't have a prayer. And there is going to be some sort, in my mind, at least I'm convinced, there's going to be some kind of a horrendous worldwide runaway inflation. And then the world, each country will pick some sort of new alternative, we just don't have the time to get into the details of that, unfortunately.
No. We'll do that another time, Richard. As a matter of fact, my engineer is telling me we've only got a minute left, but I think, I would like to just tell our listeners again, richardmaybury.com. Go there and sign up for this newsletter. Richard has a lot of investment ideas. Not only is he a historian, not only does he understand economics, how the world really works, how people really function, but he also has some investment ideas, and we don't have time to talk to you today or have him talk to you today about that, but he has some very, very good investment ideas that I think make a whole lot of sense. So you might want to just check out Richard. Richard, I want to thank you very much for joining me again today, and just tell my listeners that one of the things that you've convinced me to do, although I haven't done it personally yet, military stocks. As much as you love freedom and hate the statist system that we have, you also see the value. And I would like to get into that sometime in the near future to talk about why it's not immoral to do that, because I've always sort of had this idea, don't want to be profiting from these killing machines. But anyway, that's a topic for another day.
Okay,
Richard, thank you. Thank you.
Can I mention, you have time to mention, I've got a special report out on that exact subject. And
okay.
They can get it by calling 800-509-5400.
Okay, great. Please do that, folks. And thank you again, Richard, for being with us.